Hey, and welcome back to Workshop Wednesday. I'm Chelsea Bussemeyer. Thanks for joining me today in my workshop. And today we are going on an adventure. It's going to be a surprise to both you and me where we end up because we get to use a whole lot of creativity and ingenuity on our project today. Now, let me ask you, has your dryer ever ruined one of your favorite garments? Well, if it has, then you can relate to the sentiments that my friend felt when he took his favorite shirt out of the dryer and it looked like this. Like, I don't even know how a dryer did that. It looks melted or something like that. It's 100% cotton, so it can only burn. It can't really melt, but it somehow got tangled up and just like totally mangled. So the plan is this. We're going to use this nice blue gingham, do a little bit of a stylization to this garment, and replace this section of the shirt with the other fabric, and then see if maybe we'll add on a little bit of this extra fabric somewhere, maybe an extra pocket, maybe the insides of the cuff, maybe the inside of the collar. I don't know. We're gonna get started with this first section that needs to be replaced, and then we'll see where we go from there. So my plan of attack is this: to copy the good side of this shirt, and then to use that to cut out the new piece that I need to insert, because I want this gingham to be exactly square along the button placket. I'm gonna make the pattern first so that it's easier to cut it out, and I'm just gonna use this good side to kind of trace, because I want to make sure that the proportions of the length of the button placket and all those things are correct, and the other side is just so mangled. I think it's safer to use this side. Now, I dug out this tracing wheel. I literally have never used this cute little tracing wheel before. I probably inherited it from my husband's great aunt by way of his grandfather. Yeah, so this little tracing wheel, it's used to kind of transfer patterns. You can run along a pattern and it transfers it to the underneath paper. So what I'm gonna do is just run along the seams, keeping in mind that this is without seam allowances. And then you know what? I think I'm gonna just grab a ruler. Since this has been washed a few times, just to make sure it's nice and straight, the edge here. Transfer it. I know I need to go to kind of the bottom of the buttonhole here, at least. And then I'm also gonna do the shoulder seam, because I'm gonna have to attach it along the shoulder seam on the other side as well. So make sure that my corners are nice and sharp and everything is proportional. I'm gonna leave the cross line because we're gonna do a bit of an angle until I can measure it up on the other side, but this will get me started. So you obviously can't see where my little pinholes are, but I'm gonna just run along them with a marker so you can see where they're at. Up to here. The neck hole shape looks like this. And we'll use this again just to keep this line nice and straight. Sorry, I'm just blocking the view of the camera here. Okay. I'm gonna just cut this off here, since I've got to add the button placket to it. I'm gonna start maybe just by folding this over along the line, and then it's out of our way. Okay, now we can match up this mangled side. is the easiest way to do this. Maybe we'll flip it around. See, I told you this was going to be an adventure. I think what we're going to need to do is just pin this in place, because this is just so loose and mangled, proportionally, so that it will match up with the length of the button placket here around the collar. So all of the points where it's important that they line up. Just gonna pin them on here. Transition here at the shoulder seam. Oh, the pattern folded over. And then down the arm. Yeah, so this will help me know that the proportions of my new piece fits in here, and it's going to be correct with the side of the shirt that's still intact. It's looking a little bit loose here, so if I would have just smoothed this out and followed this side of the shirt, it would probably be a little bit torqued just because it is so mangled. So that's why I'm using the other side of the shirt as my gauge, because when I'm finished, I want both of the finished sides to match up with each other. It doesn't really need to match up with the mangled side. Okay, so now I'm going to use my little pattern wheel here and figure out what kind of an angle I can take. So I don't want to mess with that button, but I do have a little bit of wrecked fabric here. It's all right if it ends up in my seam allowance, but it won't be so great if it ends up on the shirt still. So let's say if the finished shirt, so my stitch line really, since we don't have seam allowance on our fabric underneath yet, if our stitch line runs right here, oh, this is really, really tight. The stitch line runs right here past the button, past the hole, on this side of the pocket, up to the shoulder seam. Then we should be okay. So that's going to be where my stitch line is. So I need to cut the shirt on this side of the line so that I have my seam allowance. Let's get some chalk out. I'm just going to do a 1 centimeter seam allowance. That's where I'm going to need to cut the shirt. I think rather than unstitching this original stitching, I'm going to cut it along here to create a new seam allowance for myself. Right along the top of the shoulder, and then I'll unstitch the collar and shove in my new piece into the collar band itself. Okay, so now the scary part where I actually cut this line, and then once I remove the pins here, it will reveal my new pattern underneath, where I get to add my seam allowance the other way around. So I need to add to this as well, seam allowance. Just make sure I'm aligned with my little pattern wheel dots. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, and then before I cut this, I'm going to decide what I'm going to do with this button placket. So the original placket doesn't have any interfacing, and the seam allowance only gets tucked in the width of the seam allowance, not across the whole placket. But for this one, because my gingham is a little bit lighter weight, I'm gonna do the seam allowance the entire width of the button placket itself. So if this is my folded edge, I need an extra 2 centimeters for the button placket and an extra 2 centimeters for my seam allowance. I'm just gonna add that on, cut off my extra, and then I'll be able to fold it up and make sure that it's gonna match with my neckline and with where I'm attaching it to the shirt. So I'm just gonna fold up my button placket. This is kind of like the quick, easy method for figuring out the shape you need at the neckline. And since we're kind of going down in a V, we've got it here. So now it's folded under the way I'm gonna have it stitched. So I can just follow my line. And this is including seam allowance on this edge. And I've included seam allowance in the button placket as well. So the only place I still need to add seam allowance is right here at the top of the neck. So I'm actually gonna do that right now since my pattern, sometimes I use patterns without seam allowance, sometimes I do it with, but it doesn't really matter as long as you're consistent. If you keep it like this one, where it's like 2 different things, one with, one area with, one without, that's gonna get really messy really quick. I'm just gonna add those shoulder seam allowance and around the neck here really quick so that my pattern is consistent. There we go. Because this is such a unique, kind of one-of-a-kind job, I don't really need a fancy pattern, but having my pattern here consistent so that I can just lay it on my fabric will be really helpful when I go to cut this out. So I'm gonna actually do this first and try stitching it on the original shirt before I cut the original shirt, just so that I'm kind of playing around with what I'm doing before I get myself into any type of corner. Once I've cut the original shirt, even though it's mangled, I've limited myself as to what my options are for fixing it. So this will kind of steer me clear of any unforeseen pitfalls since this is such an adventure. So I do know I want the stripes on the gingham to align straight with the button placket. Even though this is like a straight seam, sometimes the way the threads are woven in the fabric, it will get a little offset. So I'm just making sure that my pattern is lined up straight, or as straight as possible. I'm just steering clear of the selvage edge here. This side doesn't have a right or a left side, so I'm just cutting it out of this corner. Okay, so let's see what this looks like on the shirt. Because I know where the raw edge will be, and I know my seam allowance width, I can lay this piece on here, right along that raw edge, stitch it on. I'm just going to slide this down. So I still have my seam allowance at the top. And if I line it up with that marking, then I know that my placement is good for my seam allowance. Just gonna transition from the denim into the gingham, and then we'll add a little bit of kind of pops of gingham somewhere else. This was the fabric that my friend picked out for this project. I do hope he likes it by the time it's attached. What I am going to do now is already open up the collar so that I can stitch right into the seam allowance here. This is something that I'll definitely have to do, so it doesn't matter if I do it already or wait till later. And the nice thing about opening up stitches is you can always close them back the way they were originally if you decide to do something else. Once I go to actually cut into the middle of the shirt, that is a done deal thing. So it's always nice to kind of keep your options open, and if it is, you know, a once and done option, then maybe play around with it a little bit first. If it's something like this that you can always change your mind and stitch it back up, well, then you've got more options and possibilities, and you can play around with it and still not sew yourself into a corner, as I call it. There we go. Okay, well, let's get this stitched together and see what happens. So here we go. We've got this extended piece here for our button placket. It's looking not too bad. I just managed to clip past all the holes. I'll need to cut it out though before I can turn this corner, but I think it'll look nice even if I just run my stitch line right next to the original one. I'll have it like that and blend over, fold up my button placket, and reattach our collar. First things first though, I'm gonna take it over to the sewing machine. I'm gonna press my button placket in place so that it's nice and crisp, and then I'll cut out this extra so that I can turn my corner, finish that off. I'll also serge this edge just so that it's nice and clean. Snip into my seam allowance here just on the underneath fabric so that I can open it up and turn it, so when I'm serging it, it will be a little bit cleaner. I think I'll do that the first side before I attach the second side, because it'll be a little bit tight corners to get in and finish off that top edge, but we'll see how it goes. The moment of no going back has come. It's time to cut our edge. Just gonna trim off the extra on the end there. The good part is the button placket. This is the underneath part with the buttons, so it will be hidden by the top portion when the shirt is done up. Although I can imagine that with this kind of a casual shirt, you might sometimes wear it just as an open jacket. So let's see here. We'll cut our extra seam allowance here. Okay. Now I'm gonna just cut straight up into the corner here and just the denim. That way I'll be able to open it up and turn it. And I'll also be able to more easily get at the edge to finish it off with the serger. So I'm just gonna do the first half now, and then we'll do the second half. Oh, I just thought I caught it, but that's the button placket that I tacked in place. That's supposed to be flipped up. I'm gonna run down the first side here, and then we're gonna turn it, stitch the shoulder close, and serge over the shoulder. So let's get this collar band stitched together, collar finished up. Moment of truth here. Was our recovery effort successful? Well, the only person that can really determine that will be my friend when he comes to pick up this shirt. The other questions that I get to ask him is, does he want any fabric anywhere else? I've put together this little kind of faux pocket. We could add that in. Do kind of a second pocket. Oh, it needs to be straight, of course. I was also thinking it might be cuter to do, or I shouldn't say cuter when I talk to him, but cooler, let's use that terminology, to do a narrow pocket, kind of like a pen holder pocket. This friend of mine actually does design and make like custom pens, so pens are really important to him. Having a nice little pocket to show off his beautiful craftsmanship himself might be neat. I do like this little bit of red stitching. You might not really be able to see it in the corner, but the bar tacks here on the shirt are in red, so I was thinking that maybe top stitching the seam with some red thread or adding in a bar tack somewhere else. And we need to decide on buttons. The buttons are these traditional kind of jean buttons, so you can't really reuse them. I know he was hoping to be able to reuse the original ones, however one of them got wrecked and we do need 3. I'm thinking it might actually be really neat to do regular shirt buttons, since we switched out the fabric and now have this regular kind of shirt button fabric. But if we kind of do these regular shirt buttons, that might be a neat play with the back and forth nature of the fabrics. We can also look and see if we can find some brass buttons in a similar diameter, but they're gonna have a different sheen to them most likely, and also say something different. These are the real Levi's Jean Co buttons, so we won't be able to source exactly the original buttons, but I'll have to wait and see till he gets here, and hopefully he likes what we did and what we decided on. Well, that brings us to the end of this week's episode of Workshop Wednesday in this roundabout way of saving the shirt, the mission to save this favorite shirt. And I know this is such a unique project, you will probably never run into it, but it can teach us a little something of problem solving, being creative, keeping your mind open, and what are the possibilities and how you can go about just working through your own individual project, however unique that it comes along. And of course, you can jump into my Facebook group and share some pictures and ask questions if you get stuck in a corner with a unique project that you're not exactly sure what to do with, or any project for that matter. And until next week's episode, I do wish you a lot of happy sewing and fun adventures.